today we need to finish it at 11 o'clock because we need to go to the airport. Okay? Then enjoy the session, the short session.
Bom dia. So I left winter in Colorado and now I come to winter in Brazil. So I wanted to tell everyone that in the Dropbox, if you haven't been there, in the Dropbox I put the slides for every day. All right? And I have the slides for today in there. There's many slides for today because I didn't know what we would cover. So I included everything. And also, Dora, I put the article from me in the Dropbox. This is another article some of you might be interested in. Remember when we were talking about children and their social cognitive abilities and they couldn't understand complex competitive games? Well, I wrote a little article about that, and it's the label is Mead, M-E-A-D, George Herbert Mead, a social psychologist, and I think it's Mead and Youth Sports. But if anyone is interested in that, it's in the Dropbox. Okay, and today, if you have questions about deviant behavior, we can talk about that. The reading for today was chapter 8, which is on gender, and chapter 9, which is on race and ethnicity. And the problem there is that both of those chapters we could do a whole course on. And the other problem is that they're very US-centric. And I didn't think to tell you the pages that maybe you would want to skip over because it deals explicitly with the United States. But if you look at that, one of the lessons that we can learn from that is when we talk about gender and we talk about race and ethnicity, there's very, very big differences from one culture to another. And people create ideas about gender and change those ideas. They create ideas about race and ethnicity. They organize their relationships around those ideas, and then their interaction reflects those ideas. So those ideas are different from one culture to another, very different. So many of the things that many of the examples that I give about gender in the United States may not be applicable to gender in Brazil. But Katia Rubio from the University of Sao Paulo, who's a psychologist, more of a social psychologist, she wrote an article on women and sport in Brazil, and I put that in the Dropbox. And it's the original manuscript rather than the finished article. So, but she gives a nice presentation in there, and I worked with her on that paper, on the English part of it, and it was published in a book edited by Jennifer Hargraves and Eric Anderson a couple of years ago. So you can take a look at that. I think that's a nice analysis of gender in Brazil. And the material on gender, by the way, well, first of all, if you have questions on deviance, we didn't talk about the theoretical approaches, the absolutist approach and the constructionist approach. We could talk about that if you wanted to learn more about that. But if you don't have questions, then we can start talking about gender, which is probably one of the more important topics that we'll talk about during our 6 sessions together. So, any questions on deviance? Yes.
We had read this book on Vanderlei's discipline, and then we had some discussions about it. But sometimes I stand out about the deviant overconformity and deviant underconformity.
Okay.
Because you put there on the text that we need to look, try to see about the norms, the formal norms and the informal norms, to see what is deviant. Because it's something that is not okay with that norms put.
Right.
But when we talk about the deviant overconformity, sometimes I say, because you say that we need it's related to the social world that we are talking about. But when we talk, for example, about doping that you were talking yesterday, I can consider it, first of all, deviance, because there's a norm that prohibits the using of doping. But then when we talk about the social world of athletes, for them it's not going to be a deviance.
Right. They don't.
But can we consider the situation of doping deviant overconformity? Or when we talk about the social world of athletes, we can say that this is a deviance.
Yeah.
Can you understand the doubt?
And that's, you're asking a good question, because that gets to the complexity of this particular issue. And I think maybe what we should do is just start talk about the approaches to deviance first, and then I will tell you more about how we develop this concept of deviant overconformity, because it's a very difficult concept to understand. And you know, when people study deviance, many people have in the past used this absolutist approach, where you assume that social norms are based on essential principles of right and wrong, and those principles constitute an unchanging foundation for identifying good and evil and distinguishing right from wrong. So, in other words, the people who use an absolutist approach, and many people in everyday life use an absolutist approach to deviance, and they feel that norms represent important social or moral ideals, and that any departure from that ideal constitutes deviance. And the greater the departure from the ideal, the greater the deviance. Until you get, you know, when you get really far from the ideal, then we say people are perverted, you know, they're evil. You know, we have very strong terminology that we use when people's behavior goes very far from the ideal. And this is a diagram that was in the book, but if you take a look at this, this is the ideal, all right? Right here. So the ideal is, let's think of a norm. The ideal that you shouldn't lie, okay? That you shouldn't tell untruths to people. But many people tell little lies, okay? They depart from the ideal a little bit, so they're engaging in minor violations of the norm. And in most cases, unless you tell a little lie that has big implications, you don't get sanctioned very strongly. You don't get a negative sanction from other people, a very strong sanction for telling little lies, okay? But if you tell big lies in situations that have very important implications, then that's a more serious type of deviance. And the sanctions that you might experience would be everything from people marginalizing you, stigmatizing you, or putting you in prison. Okay, so, and then if you tell big lies many times, then people would say, you're a chronic liar, they would start making all sorts of moral judgments about you. They would make judgments about your character. And they would say many negative things about you. And depending on the circumstances, if you're a chronic liar, you might end up in jail, or you might end up in an insane asylum, in a hospital. So, because people would feel that you can't conform to the ideal, to the norm, and in fact, you have such a problem trying to conform that we need to isolate you from the rest of society because you no longer fit, right? And so the ideals represent ideas or traits or particular actions. Telling a lie would be an action. But some people might have a particular trait, a part of their physical appearance. Sometimes people with certain kinds of physical impairments are defined as deviant. I mean, in the past, that was very characteristic. Where someone, I mean, the Hunchback of Notre Dame is the classic example of that, where someone has a physical impairment or deformity and they're defined as a deviant and separated from the rest of society. So that would be an individual trait. Sometimes people have ideas that are deviant, and they might be ideas that would call for a revolution, call for a major change in the government, and they would be identified by people with power as being deviant, as being a departure. Their ideas are a departure from the ideal. So now, that kind of an approach to deviance is very common in religious traditions. All right? And so when I was growing up as a little Catholic boy, being taught by the nuns in a Catholic school, they were telling me about the 10 Commandments and about other norms, and they said any deviation from these ideals is deviance. All right, and so the more the deviation, the greater the deviance. So if you were raised a Catholic, I don't know if people talk about this anymore. You know, the little deviants were called venial sins, and the big deviance was called mortal sins. And the mortal sins would send you to hell, all right? And the venial sins would send you to purgatory, I guess, so for a certain amount of time. So the Catholic religion and other religions have used an absolutist approach. Now, in sociology, we started to figure out that that's not exactly how the world works. And that's not how norms work either in our everyday lives. And basically, sociologists have developed the constructionist approach, where deviance occurs when ideas and actions and traits fall outside of socially determined boundaries. And you know, even with Catholicism, by the way, you know, if you learn about Catholicism in Brazil, and then you go to Italy, and then you go to the United States or to France, what you find out is that people are interpreting rules, even the basic rules in the Catholic religion, a little bit differently. And so basically, human beings in our societies, we determine what is acceptable and unacceptable in a social world. And those boundaries of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable change over time. And they change from one situation to another. All right? So basically what we're assuming is that norms are socially constructed as people interact with each other and determine what's acceptable and what isn't. And so that's why in your family, the norms are a little bit different than another family. And you know, when children have we call it a sleepover in another house, you know, I remember when my kids and grandkids did that for the first time, they would come back and they'd say, do you know that they let their kids do this? And you know, because in their house, the norm prohibited that. But in the house where they stay, they could stay up till 11 o'clock. You know, the norms were different. So, so those norms are socially constructed, and so the boundaries vary. And deviance is socially constructed as people negotiate the boundaries. So, when the child comes back from spending the night, they say, do you know that they allow their children to stay up till 11 o'clock? And the mother or father says, well, yeah, but that's not how we do it here. And then the child says, well, maybe we should be able to stay up until 10 o'clock instead of going to bed at 9 o'clock. And they try to negotiate. And when you get to be a teenager, you're negotiating the rules all the time. You know, you want to push the boundaries so that you have more latitude, that you can be normal in a wider variety of ways, all right, and not be deviant. So, but power dynamics affect that negotiation. So mom and dad have power, and they're the ones that have the final say. And in society generally, the police, government legislators who make the rules in many cases, they have the power. And now we can negotiate as citizens to try to get some of those norms changed, laws and formal norms. But unless we have some kind of power, it's going to be difficult to get those norms changed or laws changed. So most ideas, traits, and actions that we engage in, like right now, they fall into a normally accepted range. And I might be teaching different than Dora teaches, but you know, for the norms for teachers are such that we both are falling within the normally accepted range, even though we're doing things differently. Now, if we had an ideal way to teach, then either Dora would be better than Coakley or Coakley would be better than Dora in comparison to the ideal, you know, depending how far each of us departed from the ideal. So, and that's a very, you know, impractical and distorted way to look at things. It's much easier to look at things in terms of a range of accepted behaviors related to each norm. And so basically then, the way I teach, the way Dora teaches, the way Rondeli teaches, the way Fernando teaches, we're all within the normally accepted range, I think. And so we're conforming, all right? Now, now what if, so, and you have certain expectations for me, right? So what if I came in at 9:30 instead of 9 and you waited here for a half hour doing nothing? Well, I would not be living up to your expectations. I would be underconforming, all right? And so then you would start complaining about Coakley. And if I was a regular teacher here, you would maybe avoid my classes because I was not meeting your expectations. I was underconforming. Now, if you have a society where many people underconform and engage in negative deviance, you might say, the extreme case of that would be anarchy, all right, where nobody's behavior is living up to the expectation. So, in the extreme case of deviance as underconformity, or as in the extreme cases of deviance as underconformity, where it occurs as people ignore or reject norms, that involves subnormal actions. And in extreme cases, it leads to anarchy. All right? Nobody's behavior is following norms. Okay, so, and this is where the difficulty comes in. There can be cases where people overconform. So, so I get here at 8:30, and I tell you I want you here at 8:30, so because I'm interested in making sure that you learn as much as possible. and then I give you so much reading that you can't do it all. And so what I'm doing is I'm going too far in the direction of helping you learn. All right? So actually, I'm over-conforming to norms. I'm going too far in terms of setting expectations for you to learn. And so, and my behavior would be based on an unquestioned acceptance of the expectations for a teacher. You know, I'm supposed to help you learn, right? Well, if I take that too far in a positive direction, then you would start to object and say, you know, Coakley is being unreasonable, right? He's being deviant. But it's a different kind of deviance than if I didn't show up to class, or if I didn't give you any readings. So, in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm engaging in supranormal actions. And in extreme cases, I'd have to change my example here. For example, when Adolf Hitler was trying to get people to be committed to a particular ideology and to his leadership of the German people in the 1930s, he was able to get people to go to extremes in conforming with this notion of Nordic supremacy and the primacy of the German people and the German nation. And people followed Hitler without ever raising questions about the norms that he was setting and the expectations that he had for people. And because people just blindly followed Hitler, they were over-conforming to norms. They didn't ever raise any questions. They just accepted them blindly. And in extreme cases, that's called fascism. All right? So if you started following Coakley, no matter what he said, you know, if I said, I want you to read these 20 articles by tomorrow, and you know, you did this, and you would do anything Coakley said, you would never raise questions about what Coakley was expecting of you. And if Coakley said, let's all go out and march around the campus, you would follow him along, and so on and so forth. And never say, maybe this isn't the way a class is supposed to work. But you can just blindly follow the norms and the leadership of Coakley. Well, that would be a form of overconformity, an extreme form, that we could equate with fascism. All right? Where people just blindly follow an ideology, a set of ideas, a particular kind of leader without ever asking any critical questions about what they're doing. So now let's think about that in connection with sport, because I think we have quite a bit of that in sport. And one way to explain that is related to this concept of the sport ethic. So when my colleague Bob Hughes and I were interviewing athletes, talking to coaches, we looked at books that coaches had written, we looked at books that were about athletes and coaches, we interviewed administrators, and we wanted to find out what were the core norms in sport, you know, back 20 years ago. And what we found was that both athletes and coaches said, you know, a real athlete, you know, somebody who is meeting the expectations that we have in sport, is someone who is really dedicated to the game. They put the game before everything else. And they strive for distinction. They try to move up to the next level. They try to reach particular kinds of standards. That's just what athletes do. And athletes accept risks, and they play through pain. All right? And They don't accept any obstacles in the pursuit of success. Or now we have a new word in the United States, in the pursuit of their dreams. All right? I mean, you have the dream, but you, when you face an obstacle, if you're a real athlete, you figure out a way to overcome that obstacle. You don't let anything stop you. So, those were the core norms. Now, you'll notice that one of the norms is not, thou shalt win. All right? That wasn't what made a real athlete, winning consistently or more than you lose. What made an athlete is somebody who's dedicated, strives for distinction, who plays through pain and is willing to take some risks and overcomes any obstacle that they face. And that's what athletes expect of each other. You know, when you're on the same team, there's various terms in different cultures. You know, the NFL players would say, Fernando, you know, if we're teammates on an NFL team, I'd say, Fernando, I've got your back. All right? I'm going to protect you. And I will do anything to protect you because we're teammates. And I expect the same thing from you, to protect me. And so, and by the way, Fernando, if you have a twisted knee and you're complaining and saying you can't play and you're not giving 100%, then I say, hey, look, you know, suck it up. I mean, let's, you know, endure the pain, get out there, and do what you're supposed to do, because we've got each other's back. But if you continue to complain about the pain, the coach will oftentimes separate you from the rest of the team and say, okay, you know, go over there. And I remember at the University of Texas football team, when somebody complained about pain, they put a yellow shirt on them and made them sit in a special little area that was away from the rest of the team. And you couldn't talk to them, and they couldn't talk to you, because they were no longer a part of the team, because they were not willing to play in pain. So, that's an extreme case. But there's a lot of coaches who, you know, they don't tolerate somebody who's going to complain a little bit about pain here and there. So you get players who are playing with broken ribs, they're playing with torn ligaments, they're playing with sprained ankles, and in fact, if you sprain your ankle, don't complain about it, get it taped up. And in the extreme cases, when I was playing, when I had a bad bone bruise on my heel, you don't complain about it. You let the doctor put a needle between your heel bone and the rest of your foot with Novocaine in it, and you deaden it so you can go out there and play. And people in the NFL, they have so much pain they can hardly move during the season. So they take all sorts of legal drugs, anti-inflammatories and others, to help them play the game, and then they take Vicodin and other opiates after the game in order to endure the pain enough to even get any sleep. And some of those athletes become addicted to those drugs over time. And so the point here is that those athletes they all believe in these 4 norms. And by the way, these 4 norms are good. I tell them to my kids when they were growing up. And in other words, if you're going to do something, I want you to be dedicated to it, okay? I want you to give yourself to it. And I want you to try hard and strive for some distinction here in your little soccer team, all right? And, you know, if you're running during training or during the game and you get that little stitch in your side, you know, the little pain, ignore it. Suck it up. You know? Go. Do it. And you know, if you don't like the coach, overcome that. All right? If some of the players on the team aren't your friends, you get by that obstacle. All right? You stick to it. Now that's good, right? To do that, to learn how to do those kinds of things. But what if somebody starts following those norms without ever setting any limits? All right? With an orientation where they are willing to go beyond normally accepted boundaries. Well, that's when they overconform. And I'm trying to think if I have a good slide for that. Where general norms in society would say that if you have a broken rib, you shouldn't be playing, right? I mean, everybody, we can all agree on that. And if you have a torn ligament, you shouldn't be playing. If you have a sprained ankle, you probably shouldn't be playing. And so we have general norms in society about these kinds of things. But athletes have a tendency to go beyond those boundaries that we all accept, all right? So that's when they start overconforming. And that overconformity, the coach may like it, all right? And in fact, may use it as an example of what everybody on the team should be doing. Did you just see what he did? He put his body on the line, or she put her body on the line for the team. That's what I want to see. That's what makes us a team. So everybody put your bodies on the line. And so then, if we're watching the practice, we say, oh man, that's deep. They're going past normally accepted boundaries. But that becomes very common within an athlete subculture, where athletes, not all, but where some athletes will overconform to the norms of the sport ethic. And in doing so, they'll put their bodies at risk. It's very dangerous to overconform to the norms of the sport ethic. And it can have lifelong implications. Injuries that are permanent. And, right now, I can go to football players, American football players, in college, who know that during the season, there are going to be 2,000 times where they hit their head in a way that's going to move their brain inside their skull and that fluid to a point where it's going to hit the inside of the skull a little bit and get a little bruise. Not a concussion, but just a little bruise. And then every time they twist their head really fast, during play, their brain is going to spin and hit the inside of the skull again. Get a little bruise. Now, I can show them that. I can give them the data on that, all right? And then I can say to them, maybe what you ought to do during practice is to play in a way where you're not experiencing head trauma. And they'd look at me and say, are you crazy, Coakley? And I would say, yeah, but you might have brain damage when you're 50 years old. I'm talking to a 20-year-old now. And they'd say, hey, I might blow out my knee tomorrow in practice or in a game. I might break other bones. I'm taking risks all the time. That's what athletes do. And that's why football players in the United States now, despite all the data that say this is not a good sport to be playing the way you play, they will continue to play because they're overconforming to the norms of the sport ethic. So, questions on that, or does that start to make a little bit more sense? Now, there's another factor here that's really important, and that is that ever since I've been a little kid, I'm talking as an elite athlete now, ever since I've been a little kid, this has been my dream. This is the most important identity that I have, being an athlete. And who, identities are interesting things. Identities are not something that you develop. Identities are something that other people loan to you. All right? So you know, my identity as a teacher is something that only exists if you acknowledge it and reaffirm it. I just can't go around and say I'm a teacher if nobody ever reaffirms it. Right? So, you know, I'm looking for a loan right now from you. And to acknowledge and reaffirm my teacher identity. And athletes do the same thing, only, you know, for me, if you didn't reaffirm my teacher identity, it's kind of important to me, but I have many other identities, you know? And if you don't reaffirm my identity as a teacher, then I'll go home and my wife will reaffirm my identity as a husband for 50 years. My kids will reaffirm my identity as a father, which is really important. You know, and there's other identities I have in the neighborhood and in the community and in other organizations, and I can get reaffirmation for those identities. So the lack of reaffirmation coming from you is not going to change my entire life. Right? But if you're an athlete, and this is what you've been working for, and it's the only thing you have wanted, and this is not just the most important identity that you have, it may be the only significant, salient, central identity that you have, then overconforming to those norms of the sport ethic become really important, because the only people who can reaffirm your identity as an athlete is who? Other athletes. And possibly coaches. But even more important than coaches is your fellow athletes. Not journalists, not the spectators, even though we have to smile at the spectators, but they don't know. They don't know what we go through every day. They don't know what I've given up. They don't know what I've sacrificed. They don't know how dedicated I am. They don't know how willing I am to put my body at risk. They don't know how willing I am to play in pain and overcome obstacles. Athletes don't respect fans that much because the fans are ignorant. They're ignorant of this culture that only elite athletes share. And by the way, they don't let other people in there very easily. You know, they even keep distance with journalists. And by the way, most elite athletes disdain journalists because they write articles based on a popular understanding of what an athlete is supposed to be. And that has nothing to do with really the norms that exist within the culture of sport, where athletes reaffirm their identities to each other. So the only way an athlete can get reaffirmation is from other athletes. That's why so many athletes, when you ask them, what's the most enjoyable part of your experience? And one of the things they say right off the bat is the camaraderie, the togetherness, being a part of this particular group. And what they're really saying is being a part of a group where we mutually reaffirm our identities as athletes in this special elite group that is different than other groups. All right? You people live mundane, boring lives. You know? We athletes live lives on the edge. We push the envelope. We are special. And you can't understand that because you aren't a part of us. So now that way of approaching the social world and social relationships doesn't only exist in sport. It exists in other special occupations. In fact, one of the first times I ever started thinking about this was when I read a book by, I can't remember the guy's name, but it's called The Right Stuff. And it was about astronauts and the jet pilot training that they have. And jet pilots were always this, you know, defined as a kind of a renegade group. You know, they were always doing crazy things. You know, drinking until 2 in the morning, getting just flat out fall down drunk, and then flying a plane at 650 miles an hour the next day, 6 inches away from the wing of another plane. And they respected each other for that. You know, we can live hard lives, we can push the envelope, and we can still do our jobs. Other people don't understand what it's like to be in the cockpit of a plane going 600, 700 miles an hour and 6 inches away from somebody else. You live boring, unexciting lives. We're a part of a special elite fraternity. And you know what? We do things that, they don't say it like this, we do things that other people would define as crazy. So that's what deviant overconformity is. It's an identity perpetuating set of behaviors, ideas, and traits that, that go beyond normally accepted boundaries in terms of conformity. And you know, I've talked to people who work on Wall Street in the United States, and they say that there's a lot of similarity between the traders in the, you know, on Wall Street who are right there on the floor. I mean, they work 18-hour days. They are totally dedicated to the game. I mean, you know, they can have pneumonia and they'll go to work. All right? And you know, it ruins their family relationships. They never have relationships with their kids. You know, it's and they take modafinil, which is you know, it's one of the drugs that Marion Jones tested positive for. A lot of other athletes have tested positive for. And modafinil comes in certain forms. Provigil is one of the brand name forms for it. It's different in different countries. But and I have multiple sclerosis, and I have had bad fatigue by about 4 o'clock. That's why I retired 12 years ago. So 14 years ago. But and I went to a psychiatrist because I had a lot of pain in my hands, buzzing, neurological buzzing things, and this tremendous fatigue. And he gradually started to figure out what was going on with me. And he said, "Have you ever tried Provigil?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, it was developed in the military, for the military, for people who are doing like 24-hour guard duties and so on. You know, people who have to stay awake to save lives, basically, and they have to be alert, and they can't be drugged out, you know, or caffeine buzzed. They have to be just cognitively and physically ready." Well, they developed this drug. It is a miracle drug. I mean, if you're an athlete, have you ever gotten up on the day of a competition and know, this is the day, you know? I am ready. I feel good. I feel sharp. Everything is in focus. My body feels good. Well, if you want that feeling every day, you take a Provigil. And that's what Marion Jones is doing, and that's what a lot of other athletes were doing. But it's not on the banned substance list, and it's difficult to mask. So, but I took it, and for a long time, and I'm not going to give you the whole story, but I don't do it anymore. But there were no bad side effects. It didn't give you a buzz. I was just cognitively alert and ready, and I think, why did I retire? You know, after I was taking this. And instead of fading out at 4 o'clock, you know, I could work until midnight. And I said, why would you want to work until midnight? Isn't that over-conforming? Well, yeah. You know, so, and those Wall Street people are taking it because they're working 18-hour days. I used to get it from my sister-in-law, who's a nurse, and after a while, I couldn't get it from her anymore because the doctors were all using it. And the ones in the emergency room who needed to stay awake and alert, and they were doing 15-hour shifts, they were taking modafinil. And then I was talking to a flight attendant, and she called it the pilot's drug. And so, and in Wall Street, they call it the trader's drug. So, so basically what these people are doing is they're taking drugs in connection with their overconformity. All right, so they can continue to meet unreasonable expectations. Expectations that go beyond anything that we would define as normal. They're being supra-normal. Okay, and not subnormal. They're being supranormal, so they're overconforming. And they do it partly because their trader identity, their pilot identity, their doctor identity, their lawyer identity, when you're doing a brief all night and you got to be fresh in court the next morning. So those people are all going beyond normally accepted boundaries. So my point here is, hey, we can have deviant overconformity as well as underconformity, and athletes are probably doing it as much as anybody, maybe more. Okay? And in sport, probably more dangerous than in most other occupations because you're actually physically putting your body on the line in many sports. So it's dangerous. So why do they do it? Because, you know, playing a sport is so darned exciting. I love it. You know, when I'm out on that field, nothing else matters. I mean, this is what I was meant to do. And athletes who think that way will do almost anything to stay involved, to keep getting reaffirmation for who they are, and to stay on the field. Okay? Not just to win, but one of the ways to stay on the field is win, at least regularly enough that you can stay at the level, at the competitive level that you are. And being selected to play for high-performance sports often requires overconformity to the norms of the sport. The coaches look for overconformance. They spot them and they pick them out and say, this is who I want. You know, these are the people who are not just tough, they're over-tough. I mean, they are willing to take toughness to a level that normal people would define as crazy. Deep. And exceeding normative limits creates drama and excitement. And you know what it does? It leads to really strong bonds between athletes. Because when we overconform together, we have done things that nobody else does for each other. And that creates these really strong bonds, this camaraderie that athletes continue to talk about. And when you talk to retired athletes, what do you miss the most? Not winning, not championships. I miss being in the locker room with all of those men or women. You know, that's the core of who I am. And you know, when I retired, I didn't get reaffirmation for that identity anymore because I wasn't around athletes. And so then you have athletes who are kind of lost in a way. I mean, they have to learn how to reconnect with their family, reconnect with their kids, reconnect with friends, and develop new identities, or nurture the identities that have kind of been dormant. Boy, that's going a long way. One thing. Okay. Is it starting to get clearer now?
Yeah, but sorry, I need to question. I have another question because think about the examples that you are using. Is it possible to think about a point in a social world? Mm-hmm. Thinking about the athlete's social world, that this overconformity becomes a conformity, like, you know, it's so common, so everybody's doing this, mm-hmm. that this overconformity becomes the rule.
Right, becomes conformity. I mean, you know, it ceases to become overconformity. It's just normal. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the tricky part of this concept, because the athletes will say that what we're doing out there, we just expect of each other. This is normal for us, but everybody else would say it's outside of the normally accepted range. All right, and that's kind of the secret. You know, it's if everybody else in the whole society started to change and push that boundary further and further, then it would no longer be overconformity. It would just be a form of conformity, okay? Inside the range of acceptance, right? So the real secret here is not just looking at the culture of sport, but looking at the culture of sport within the context of the society.
Right? Like the identity. The example of the identity that you use.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this is also tricky because, you know, watching people overconform can be exciting, right? We know it's deviant, but we're really attracted to it. And when athletes provide us with that excitement and pleasure, we might be a little more willing to grant them latitude when they violate regular norms in the rest of society. They drive their car too fast. They drink too much. They get in a fight. And we're more likely to excuse them in some cases because they have been a source of excitement for us as spectators, even though we know that that excitement is a form of deviance. So, and this is where sociologists get in big debates because they say all deviance should be punished. If it's not punished, it's not deviance. And I'm saying, you know, there are some forms of deviance that aren't going to be punished because of other factors, because that deviance is serving as a form of entertainment or excitement, or we can use it as an example when we talk to our kids, or so we're going to let the athletes do that, and then we put these athletes on these pedestals because they're willing to overconform. And so when a police officer comes after a fight, and the athlete is the one that started the fight, the police officer comes, and instead of arresting the athlete, says, "Can I have your autograph?" You know, so that overconformity has implications even outside of the culture of sport. And that's one of the things we're wrestling with right now, is, you know, when athletes engage in negative, underconformity or negative deviance in the rest of society, are we going to treat them any differently because they're an athlete? And, you know, judges struggle with that, police struggle with that, people struggle with that. So, and athletes, when they feel that you're going to give them a little bit of a break, then you know, they end up developing this reputation of being kind of a party person, or, you know, a fighter or whatever. So they take advantage of our willingness to put them on this overconformity pedestal. So, you know, this exciting and exhilarating experience that you have as an athlete, have you ever read Greek mythology and the story about Icarus and Daedalus? You know, when they were in the maze, I'm trying to think of the name, but they were in the maze and they couldn't get out, and Daedalus fashioned a pair of wings for Icarus and wings for himself, and he said, "We can fly out of this maze, but be careful, Icarus." Icarus was his son. "Be careful, Icarus, because if you fly too high and get too close to the sun will melt your wings." And so the journey of the hero, according to Greek myth, is to not overconform, which is really interesting. Because when Icarus started flying with Daedalus knew what the hero's quest was. It was to fly the middle way and to get to the safety and over the water. Meanwhile, Icarus says, "Oh man, this is the greatest." And he forgot, kept going higher and higher. The sun melted his wings. He went into the ocean and died. Well, that was the "don't be an overconformist" myth that the Greeks developed. Right? So don't let this exhilaration of being an athlete or doing something else carry you into a realm that's going to be destructive. And that's a lesson that athletes should learn. Because Daedalus was saying, you know, even as a hero, you've got to set some limits. all right, in terms of conformity and over-conformity. If you don't draw that line, you're going to be a dead non-hero. So, but athletes haven't read that myth, so they don't, and coaches haven't. So, so anyway, that's that. Do you have other questions about deviant over-conformity? So, let me just give you one. This illustration, I think, is one of the best things I've ever seen. It's not all me. It's Christophe Brissonneau from France, who was a professional cyclist for years, and has been studying cyclists now for 20 years. And he and what's old supposed to mean? But anyway, Christophe said, you know, and this was at the height of the so-called doping in professional cycling. You know, when Lance Armstrong got caught, and they said, we're going to take your Tour de France medal away from you, and they said, okay, who are we going to give the gold medal to? You know, who are we going to move into the top 3 now? And what they figured out was, in the top 20, they couldn't find anybody who wasn't doping. All right? I mean, they couldn't find anybody to give the medal to. And they didn't talk about that a lot because that was kind of bad publicity for them, because sport's supposed to build character and make people perfect and all of this stuff. And obviously, you know, that wasn't exactly the case, and they didn't want to advertise it. So, so they tried to police the doping more accurately. But they have a hard time because they don't want to have too many false positives with their tests and so on. So they have to give the athletes a little bit of leeway. And those athletes know that. And they try to, just like we play to the level of the ref. Do you use that term here? You know, in basketball or volleyball, if we know how referees are going to call the norms, how they're going to interpret and enforce the norms, some referees give you more latitude. You know, the boundaries are wider. And others, you think, oh, no, we've got this ref, they won't, you know, he won't let you do anything. But then another ref lets you do more. But how do you find out? Well, you push the boundary and you see what happens. Just like teenagers do with their parents. And if the ref doesn't call the foul, you push it a little bit more. And you find out where this referee is setting the boundary. And that's part of being an athlete, is figuring that out. How are the boundaries being set for this game? And so, what Christophe did in his interviews with athletes is he asked them to give him their histories. And what he found out was, when they first started riding their bike and participating in little races here and there, they were discovering cycling culture. The norms, the expectations, how you tune your bike, all of those kinds of things. And they weren't using any substances, you know, as 12, 13, 14-year-olds. And who was their medical caregiver? It was their general practitioner, you know, their everyday doctor. That's who they went to. And then in the second phase, he called it an apprenticeship to being a professional athlete. And in this second phase, this apprenticeship phase, what happens is you become a little bit more serious about your cycling. And you start to discover the legal products that will help you train harder and train longer and maybe compete even a little bit better. But they're legal, all right? And so you take iron, you take your B12, sometimes even B12 injections, you take magnesium, you take all of these supplements. We have supplement stores all over the United, you know, GNC and this and that. You can go online, you can order supplements until you spend $1 million, all right? And so everybody's looking for the right substance for that. You know, and we banned ephedrine, which really got you up so that you could really train. But now there's all sorts of ephedrine substitutes. You know, I can point them out to you in GNC. And you can go buy them. And now, you take them, you wait 20 minutes, and you're ready to work out. All right? And they're legal. So, and who do you go to then? Well, then you look for the sport medicine doctor. You know? Like, you know, when my daughter blew out her knee on Sunday, she said, you know, I've got to go to a sport medicine doctor. Now, is she in the apprenticeship phase? No, at 47 years old, no. But she takes some things to help her get out there and have some energy when she's playing after a long day as a social worker. So, but then for the people who are actually trying to become professional athletes, then when you move into the realm of professional sport, this is an extraordinary world. You are no longer part of the ordinary world. And you start to see cycling as what you do for work. I mean, this is your job. And you need products to do your job. So now it's cortisone, it's anabolics, it's other substances. And this is Christoph talking, and it's doping. And this is what he found with the cyclists. And people become obsessive over body maintenance and body control. Lance Armstrong knew his body inside and out. He regulated his body every second of the day, and every milligram of things that he consumed was done strategically. And he trained harder than anybody else in professional cycling. In fact, his teammates could not train with him. They all wanted to get off the bike at hour 5, and Lance Armstrong was going to hour 6.5. And they said, hey, you know, we can't keep up with you. And you know what Lance said? Well, then you're not going to be on my team anymore, so you better figure out a way to keep up. Okay. And by the way, I know how to keep up. You do EPO. You take erythropoietin, or you blood boost, all right? Because that will help you endure things so that you can train 6.5 hours. And they did. And then they write their exposés, you know, Hamilton and others saying, Lance made me do it, Lance made me do it. Well, Lance didn't make him do it. If they wanted to be on the team, they knew what they had to do. All right? So instead of going to a sport medicine doctor, now you're going to a performance physiologist. Right? And then when you really get to be a professional, you train to be a champion, you take products to win, not just do your job. You do EPO, HGH, other substances, and now you go to a biotechnologist. And these people are not oftentimes part of the sport team. These are private people, and if you have enough resources, they've got things that you can take that WADA doesn't know about, USADA doesn't know about, and are not illegal in some cases. And in fact, if you have enough money, you can pay for that person to do that for you and your friends until they make a mistake, like the guy who was working for the Jamaican track team, and the sprinters got caught. You know, it's always interesting. There's always 3 or 4 that get caught at once, and they're working with the same biotechnology. So then, when you leave the extraordinary world of professional sport, you re-enter the ordinary world, and you try to become normal. But that's really hard to do after you live the life of an elite athlete, is becoming normal. So sometimes you take products to escape or forget. Amphetamines, alcohol, sleep aids, hash, cocaine, cannabis, and then you end up going to a medical care person who's an addiction specialist. Okay, so this is Christoph's socialization model. You know, none of these things happen like that. It's all gradual. You know? you just kind of get in, you start to learn more and more about how to do things, you know, what's happening within the sport. Now, I'm not saying every athlete is taking illegal drugs. That's not my point here. The point is that all athletes go through a socialization process, and in some sports, that socialization process involves taking substances that are illegal. And they have known in the past how to mask them. Caffeine will mask certain anabolic steroids, for example. And so they know all of this. There are people spending their entire careers figuring out how to get around a lot of rules. Biochemists and others. And if you have enough money, you can buy their knowledge. So, but not everybody does that, okay? So Coakley isn't a total cynic. I'm a little cynical, but not a total cynic. So doping then becomes part of this overconformity. And that's, so in other words, my point is that WADA is treating doping as underconformity. And you know, it ain't working. If they were to treat it as overconformity, they would come up with some new ways to control overconformity. You know, if you think it's underconformity, you just say we got to police more. And we got to punish more. But that's not doing it. So, but if you say that it's overconformity, then what you would say is we have to figure out ways to help athletes set boundaries. And we've got to work with the sport federations to do that. We don't want competition schedules to be over-demanding. We want limits put on certain kinds of training. Oh man, that's a difficult one, all right? The person who trains until he or she drops, they're the ones that the coaches want. So to try to tell people in sport that we've got to set limits and follow Daedalus's example says, no, you know, we're gonna go the route of Icarus. And the coach says, you know, if they burn up and drown, I got another one that I can draft. You know, there's a lot of young people out there who are living the dream. And I'll just, when their bodies break down, I'll just get another body. So that's kind of what we're in, and it really creates a lot of danger in sport at the elite level. And I know this is kind of strange. Some people say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I know athletes, they don't dope. They don't, you know, they take substances of some sort, but they don't dope. And I agree with you. I agree with you. There are other athletes who feel that taking some illegal substances are almost a requirement in order to maintain their identities as athletes, to stay in the sport at the level that they are at, the professional level. And if you're a football player or American football player and you will not consent to taking big shots of anti-inflammatories, the coach will cut you. And none of their contracts pay them after that time. So, because there's so many guys who want to play football in the NFL, we'll just get another body. Somebody who's willing to take control. So that's becoming a problem. So we just talked about athletes. We didn't talk about institutionalized corruption, other things. But let me give you one point about institutionalized corruption. You've read about FIFA, right? You've read about the IOC. You've read about various IOC representatives and FIFA representatives in various parts of the world who are, you know, doing contracts with marketing companies and taking 10% for themselves, and, you know, walking around with bags of cash. Andrew Jennings is a reporter, an investigative reporter, who has studied this stuff for the last 25 years, and he's a good friend of mine, and he lived in my house while he wrote the book for, what was it called? The first one was The Lords of the Rings, and then it was The New Lords of the Rings, and that's the one he lived at our house for. And he studied the USOC, got thrown off the SOC, got me thrown off the SOC campus, and I had to sneak out just to use the library. But Andrew is really good at digging into this information. He never makes a conclusion unless he's got it on paper. And he's got information about officials from Brazil, officials from the Caribbean, who have basically skimmed off millions and millions of dollars from the whole enterprise of world soccer and the Olympics. And so, but it's really tough. It's really tough to enforce norms with these NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Because who's going to enforce norms of a global NGO when there's no local police? You know, and sport organizations have always been the old boys, you know, right? I mean, it's the guys that got together, they're the federation people. And, you know, back when the stakes were low, and, you know, sport was kind of a fun thing to do, and, you know, we traveled a lot, and that was about it. But now the stakes are billions, billions and billions of dollars. So, you know, when FIFA walked away from the World Cup in Brazil, they took with them, what was it, $2.5 billion? Yeah, $2.5 billion. Meanwhile, you know, Dilma's got debt. So, but they made off like bandits, all right? And so, but who's going to enforce? Who's going to tell the IOC that somebody ought to go to jail? We don't have any enforcement agency that can do that. So what do? We try to say, oh, the IOC is corrupt. And so what does the IOC do? They say, oh, we're going to do an investigation, all right? We're going to investigate ourselves. And they do a 6-month investigation, they come out a report and they say, everything is okay. So the enforce thing is like, you know, the fox guarding the hen house. It is, so all of these NGOs in sport now, that the stakes have gotten higher, and all of the other rewards associated with sport have gotten significantly higher. Now there's a lot of motivation to do things that are outside the normally accepted range of behavior. But there's nobody, we don't have any agency to enforce those norms. So, there's no transparency, there's no accountability. You know, and why would they be transparent when nobody's enforcing the norms? You know, if nobody is ever going to call you on your actions, and you can be secretive and have no accountability at all, your actions are more likely to become illegal. And that's what's happening in sport. So we've got a real challenge, because the corruption not only related to the national governing bodies, but related to gambling, for example, on a global level, are really significant. But how do you enforce norms related to gambling, and I don't know what you call it in Brazil, but not just match fixing, but cooperating on spot bets. You know what spot bets are? I mean, you can bet that you know, Coxa beats Atletico, but then and you bet because sometimes Atletico might get one goal in the bet. So you know, if you want to win, Coxa would have to win 2-0 in order for you to win the bet. If it's 2-1, then it's just an even, nobody wins. So there's a point spread. Then there's spot bets, like who gets the first yellow card? Who gets the first red card? Who scores the first goal? Who assists on the first goal? Who scores the third goal? And those spot bets, people are betting on, because if you know a referee and you can get to them and say, your kids are in danger, unless you give a yellow card to Neymar, the first yellow card of the game, of the match. And that's been happening, not that example, but that's been happening not at the top league level, but at the secondary and tertiary levels. And then you get people betting on that because they know. And they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars on their bets on who gets the first yellow card. So, and how are you going to enforce that now? Because all this gambling is online. And you know, the sites change from 1 minute to the next. But that in itself can completely disrupt the integrity of the game, undermine the integrity of the games. If people don't think that the score is something that's a part of the game, but is actually being shaped by referees or our players, then they lose interest. And in the United States, some college players have gotten caught doing that. You know, they're favored by 20 points, a basketball team. You know, my basketball team is favored by 20 points over Fernando's team. And somebody comes to me before the game and says, you know, we're going to bet on Fernando's team, so you can still win, but you win by 15 points, not by 20. And I said, well, you know, that sounds pretty reasonable. You know, we're still going to win. And you're going to give me $10,000, and you know, I'm broke. And so when it comes to the free throws towards the end of the game, you know, mine don't go in. And when it comes to a pass toward the end of the game, my pass goes over my teammate's head. Because we're up 20, and I got to get it down to 19. So, and that's easy to do. Easy to do. If we can't police it. And that's a problem. So gambling is an issue. I'm not against gambling, but spot betting is the worst, because most athletes will not roll a game. All right, they will not lose on purpose, but they will do little things in the game, like commit a foul, because of a spot bet. So we've got to try to eliminate spot betting somehow. I don't know how, but that's an issue. Do you mind if we go another half hour and then just call it a day? You know, we have to leave at 11, and we can take a 15-minute break and then go to 11. No break?
No, if you have to leave at 11,
yeah,
it would be really sad to.
Okay.
I know, that's my opinion.
So, pardon me? Yeah, we'll go to 4 till 11. I don't know. I don't need a break. I'm overcommitted. So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I have 4 sisters, 3 granddaughters, a daughter, and a wife, and I'm very sensitive to gender kinds of issues, and and gender is a really complex phenomenon. You know, the way people think about masculinity, femininity, homosexuality, heterosexuality, and other aspects of gender and sexuality are really complex. They differ greatly from one society to the next. And this, I use this particular UFC photo because these women in the past, and even today among many people, are being defined as invaders of male space. I mean, they are gender benders, all right? They are not conforming to the expectations that many people have related to femininity in various cultures. And again, there's going to be some differences from one culture to another. But as gender benders, Ronda Rousey, and I can't think of the other person's name right now, but they have pushed the boundaries of gender a little bit among a lot of people in the United States, the way they think about gender. At first they said, this is sick. You know? This is sick. I can't watch women do this. That's not the way women are supposed to be. And then they saw a couple of matches, and they said, God, these women are tough. I mean, these women are, I've never seen women like this. And they start to think, well, maybe I ought to, you know, not change my attitudes, but at least push the boundaries of what I define as acceptable with respect to femininity. And if you remember in the second chapter, Michael Mesner, when he did a study of the youth sports, which is a really fascinating study for me, because I've seen the same thing in the sports that I've watched. You know, we have gender segregated sports, even among little kids, and the coaches relate to girls, you know, treat girls differently than the coaches treat the little boys. You know, when a little girl cries at 5 years old in a soccer game, you know, the coach goes over and gives him a little hug and says, okay, it's going to be okay. The little boy, a 5-year-old, cries and says, boys don't cry, suck it up, get out there. And if you cry again, you're out of here. So, you know, there's a lot of different things going on when it comes to gender. So gender, a lot of people think of gender as an individual characteristic. But really, when you stop and think about it in a sociological way, gender is meaning. In other words, gender consists of a lot of interrelated ideas about what you're supposed to do as a man or a woman, ideology, gender ideology. And that ideology and the gender categories that we have, male and female, right? And what do we call those categories? Opposite sexes. Now, if you're a biologist, you know darn well that 98% of the characteristics of men and women, if you listed all the physiological characteristics of men and women, there'd be 98% overlap. But we have created socially 2 categories that we call opposites, when we're 98% the same. All right? So we have done some really interesting things with biology in terms of our social definitions. So we associate particular colors with gender. You know, are you going to have a boy? Then we paint the room blue. Are you going to have a girl? Well, we paint the room pink or whatever. And, you know, if you are going to have a little girl, we're going to get these kinds of outfits. You know, this is on a two-day. Because we want to identify that child from birth in terms of one of these 2 categories. All right? And also, gender is performance. So people learn how to act like a man and act like a woman. We learn how to walk like a man. We learn how to walk like a woman. We learn how to inflect our voice. We learn how to pass each other on the sidewalk. You know, in the United States, I can get to the door at the same time as a woman. And that woman will say, sorry. You know, because she feels that she's in my way. Now, I could come to that same door or that same crossing point with a man, and we just negotiate our way and get around each other and do our thing. But there are many women who, when they get to that point, they will apologize for being there and say they're sorry. Now, some people say that's polite. Well, that's gender, and that's the way gender works. Women are more like, the women learn that when it comes to relationships with men have first dibs on space, and women should take up as little space as possible and stay out of the way of men. And now, that's an over-exaggeration. A lot of you women are saying, oh man, I don't do that. But do you say sorry when you get to that point? and many of you don't, right? But a number of women still do. And so people perform gender, and they judge others by their performances. You know, so if you're a woman and you have some hair on your lip, in some cultures you're going to hear about it right away, right? And they're going to say, you know, why don't you get rid of that? Get it, shave it, or get it, or do an electrolysis, or do something, but get rid of that. And you say, but that's the way God made me. And the sociological response is, well, that's not how we've socially constructed gender. I don't care how God made you. You better shave that, shave this, and wear this, and have your hair this way, and do all of these other things, even though they're not normal. They're not biologically you. Because biology is not the issue. We have socially constructed what it means to be a man or a woman. And we judge other people. So if a man is walking a little bit in what we might call an effeminate way, people would make fun of that person. And now we're raising questions about that all the time because we're negotiating some of the boundaries here, but men live in a much tinier accepted range of behavior, ideas, and traits than women do. And this is interesting because a lot of women say, well, wait a minute, we don't have power, and I'll get to that in a minute. And that's a big issue. And women have greater latitude. If you look at little girls, they have much more latitude to do things than little boys. You know, little girls can pretend they're male heroes, action heroes. You know, but if a little boy pretends he's a female hero, or a female character in a story or a cartoon or whatever, people will say, you got a problem here, Mom. You better get your child to be more boy-like. Meanwhile, the girl is out there, you know, doing all sorts of things. And you know, a lot of the women in here are cross-dressed. Right? You know, how many of the women in here have ever bought a piece of clothing in a men's department or a men's store? I'd be surprised if everybody has. And if I ask the men in here, how many men in here have bought anything in a women's department or a women's store to wear? You know, when I asked that to 200 introductory sociology students, almost all the women will say, yeah, I've got a tracksuit, sometimes I've bought men's shoes because women's shoes don't fit my foot. You know, I wear men's t-shirts, I wear men's this. In fact, one of the sexiest things you can do is put on a men's dress shirt. Just kind of walk in. We have advertisements all the time. A woman in a men's dress shirt. We say, oh man, that's really kind of sexy. Well, you know, if a man put on a negligee and we put him in a commercial, we wouldn't be saying that's really sexy. Okay? Men live in a much more constrained world than women. Right? And so we can call a little girl in the United States a tomboy because she likes to be rough, she likes to play rough, she likes to do things that a lot of people say are boy things, and we call her a tomboy, and that's a compliment to little girls, you know, because you know, males have a standard anyway, and if you're kind of male-like, then, you know, that's a compliment. Until you get to be 13 years old. And then, if you're called male-like, then it becomes an issue because you're really now trying to fit in with expectations related to femininity. So if you're going to play tough sports, some women will engage in what we call the female apologetic. They'll make sure that their hair is longer, and you know, you see girls in rugby, my granddaughter plays rugby, they all have their ponytails, and some of them will even will make sure that they have times when they can dress up and make sure that they let everybody know, I play rugby, but I'm a real girl. I'm a real female. And because if you don't do that, then people will start thinking maybe you're not a real female, according to our socially constructed categories. So, so basically what we've done is we've created a form of masculinity and femininity that are mutually exclusive. And so we've created a two-sex approach to gender. But that doesn't fit with the biological world, because a lot of people don't fit into one of those categories or another, either because of physiological characteristics or because of preferences in terms of the way they would like to dress, act, and think. And women have a little bit more latitude than men do in that case. So we assume two mutually exclusive categories that are opposites, psychologically, physiologically, and socially, and it leaves little or no space for people who don't fit into one of these categories. And this diagram, I've worked on this thing for years, but this diagram shows what's going on. You know, here's femininity, here's masculinity, and here's people that don't fit clearly into either category. They're gender nonconformers, all right? And those gender nonconformers are outside the normative boundaries for masculinity or femininity. Now, girls and women can push boundaries more frequently without being sanctioned. All right? They can push into male areas more easily than men can push into female areas. When men try to push boundaries, you know what other men do? They police the boundaries. And they start calling them fags, queers, homos, whatever the words are in Portuguese. And that's because they want to protect their access to power. Because power has been equated with masculinity. And if we let men be kind of feminine or not, you know, in a real constrained way masculine, then all of a sudden we might jeopardize our access to power. So you know what? We're going to enforce gender norms much more closely than women do. Because power is at stake. You know, political power, economic power, religious power, power in every major social institution. So men police boundaries much more closely than women do. And in terms of determining what's natural and normal. And so when Bruce Jenner, the decathlon gold medal winner in 1976, the best athlete in the world, and I watched him do the decathlon, and he was unbelievable. And he won the gold medal against the Russian and against the German, who were supposed to win, and he was a tremendous athlete. And so here's Bruce, you know, after he won his gold medal, he was the epitome of masculinity in the United States. And he made a lot of money, you know, endorsing products because, you know, people felt that because he was the epitome of masculinity, you know, he's somebody that we should listen to, live like, and so on. Well, Bruce Jenner married into this family called the Kardashians. I don't know if you're ever familiar with any popular culture in the United States, but married into this family, the Kardashians, and over time he felt comfortable with the Kardashians telling them that ever since he was four years old, he never felt like a man, like a boy. He always felt that he viewed the world in a feminine way. He felt that he, in terms of his terminology now, he felt that he had a male body and a female soul. And he felt that this lack of synchronicity kept him off balance for his entire life. And in fact, that being off balance was so threatening to him that he dedicated his life to becoming a decathlon champion, because that's the epitome of masculinity. So he was so afraid that somebody would discover that he had the soul of a female, you know, that's his words, that he became the epitome of masculinity. He worked, he trained, he built his body so that he measured up, he muscled up. All right? And now, 65 years old, but starting about 15 years ago, he started to think, you know, I can't live like this anymore. And because, he didn't say this, but this is what I'm saying, because we've divided sex into two mutually exclusive categories, and any deviation from that is defined as deviant, and in this as being gender nonconformity, he had to make a choice. Either stay uncomfortable and present himself as a man, or get into this other box and present himself as a woman and feel comfortable. Because we won't let people stay in between. That confuses us. Right? So a lot of people who are transgender now, they, instead of just being partly male and partly female in a social way, and presenting themselves that way, you know, a lot of people just don't accept that. So they feel compelled to go all the way, have surgeries, you know, completely present in terms of the other gender and the other sex in some cases. So here's Bruce about 5 years ago, or 7 years ago, I guess. And he had started to take hormone shots and so on, estrogen. And this is him now with his earrings and trying to present himself as a female. He's got longer hair today. But he just did a 2-hour interview on television, and it was heart-wrenching listening to this interview about how he struggles with this socially constructed ideas about gender, and that he felt that he never fit, even though he was the epitome of masculinity. So he now, as a 65-year-old, is going to, he doesn't know about surgery yet, but he's had the hormones and he's developing breasts. And he had a little plastic surgery to cut down the sharpness of his jaw. And he's also doing some other things, wearing some makeup and other things to start presenting. And he's been doing this gradually. And he's had 2 former wives, and they are very supportive of him. He's got 6 kids of his own, 4 adopted kids, 10 kids, who all call him father. And the 6 kids that he's had with his wife, with his one or the other wife, 3 wives, they all call him father, and they are tremendously supportive of him too. And he says, I'm always going to be your father. I'm just not going to look like other fathers look. And they say, that's okay. We want you to be comfortable with who you are. But you can tell. I mean, they're struggling with this because gender is so deeply ingrained in the way we view the world that it's part of our identities, it's part of how we act, it's part of the meanings that we give to ourselves, it's part of how we fit into social organization. You know, trade spots with your brother. You know, just in terms of what he does, who he is, what positions he holds, and have him trade places with you. And you'd feel out of sync in many ways because you've learned how to be male or female. And but there's a lot of people, and we know more and more of them now, who don't fit into this 2-sex categorization scheme that we've developed. And other cultures, by the way, have other categories. They have categories for people who don't fit. And there's some culture, a couple of cultures that have 5 categories. A number of cultures have 3 categories, at least, to provide some support for people who don't fit into the male or female category. So, but most cultures draw the line, two separate, opposite, non-overlapping categories. So, now what does this have to do with sport? One of the things that it has to do is the stronger women get in society, the more men love masculine sports. The terminology in the United States is, this was a book written by a friend of mine, it's called The Stronger Women Get, the More Men Love Football. And what that means is, as women become more male-like in terms of strength, power, CEO positions, full professors, all of these kinds of things that were male territory in the past, the stronger women get across all of these institutional spheres, the more likely men are going to be defensive. And they're going to emphasize the things in the culture that highlight extreme masculinity, like football in the United States, American football, like soccer in Brazil. So the stronger women get in Brazil, the more popular soccer is going to get among men. And women are going to start watching too. And then the more popular soccer is going to get, period. So, and that's part of the gender dynamic, interesting. So, but it also is part of a process that's disrupting old ideas about gender ideology. And because gender ideology traditionally has been a way for men to maintain their superiority in terms of traits that are associated with status and power. And women are defined as inferior to men except in their ability to nurture. And you can just look at the occupational structure right now, and you can see women go into nurturing professions more often than men do. And if you're a man and you want to teach, if you want to be a hairdresser, open up a salon, if you want to teach children in a preschool, if you want to become a nurse, if you want to do things that have been traditionally associated with nurturance and femininity, people are going to say, why do you want to do that? Or they're going to raise questions about you. And the strange thing is that men who want to go into some of these nurturing things, people want to do background checks on them and make sure they're not perverts. Because why else would a man want to nurture other than to get close to somebody and exploit them? So, this is an interesting thing. In sport, the problem has been that women who have wanted to participate in sport have been defined as invaders of traditional male space. And at first, when the first women invade, what do they get called? Dykes, lesbians, queer, whatever the words are in Portuguese. But then over time, we've accepted women in certain sports. But if you take a look at the sports that women have been accepted in over the years, they were first the grace and beauty sports, all right? Figure skating, diving, gymnastics, the ones where we score on form as well as athletic ability. Those were the grace and beauty sports. That emphasize coordination, not strength. So when you talk to a figure skater, like I'm using an old name, Tara Lipinski, who won the gold medal a few Olympics ago, they said, what's the hardest thing you've ever done or in figure skating? And she said, the hardest thing for me is to be strong enough to do a quadruple jump while at the same time looking feminine enough to get a good score. So, my parents spent $10,000 on my teeth. I spent $3,000 on each outfit. I have a makeup artist, I have a hairstylist, I'm spending all of this money on all of this stuff and meanwhile, I'm trying to hide those quads and those calf muscles, and the other things that, you know, I want to be real careful. I don't want them to get too bulging because then that will affect my score. I won't fit the form that the judges are looking for. And in gymnastics, we've institutionalized that so that you've got to have a prepubescent body in order to fit the standards. And we could change those standards right now if we wanted to in gymnastics. And we'd stop girls from taking puberty-delaying drugs and engaging in eating disorders and all of the other things that go with gymnastics in order to try to maintain conformity with the form that the judges want. You know, you're a pound too heavy. You better lose that pound. How do you do it? Well, I eat apple skins all day. That's it. And, or, when I have a meal, I go to the restroom. But those are the reasons we sports. Then what did women become involved in? Sports where there were nets separating them from their opponents, or lane dividers. Because we didn't want women touching each other. That's for men to do. Okay? Men can touch women, women shouldn't be touching them in sport. So they played tennis, they played badminton, they swam with lane dividers, they did other things that either had nets or something that prevented contact. Because the first women who started playing basketball, hockey, ice hockey, and some of those sports that involved contact soccer, they experienced a lot of pushback within the culture. Because they were doing something that had been identified with masculinity for centuries. So, and those women were ostracized. They, you know, people said that they looked funny, they walked funny, they acted funny, you know, but they looked, acted, and walked like athletes, but not like women. And so, so basically, the world has been male-dominated, male-identified, male-centered, the sport world. And as women have become involved, they have challenged that male domination, male-centeredness, male-identified. But they haven't made a lot of progress in a lot of countries. You know, you can go to Sao Paulo and go to the football museum there, and I dare you to find an image of a woman in that museum, in that Hall of Fame. It's all pictures of men. I was looking for Michael. I mean, one of my favorite athletes in the world. And Brazil doesn't even show it in their Hall of Fame. Because to Brazilians, the Hall of Fame is a men's spot, not a women's spot. So, and by the way, I'm not making fun of Brazil, same way in the United States, all right? So, except we have forms of feminism and political actions taken by women that have pushed in different ways than women in Brazil. And I'm not saying women in Brazil haven't pushed. They've just pushed in different ways. And maybe Halls of Fame haven't been a high priority. Maybe other things have been. In the United States, it's been a high priority, and you'll find women in Halls of Fame now. Not many, but they're there. So, but all of those things, when we talk about the World Cup, I always say it's the men's World Cup or the women's World Cup. But, you know, because sport has been male identified, it's the World Cup and it's the women's World Cup. Because you just assume that it's men when it's sport and a World Cup. So you always have to put that adjective in front of World Cup or championship or whatever if it's women. So, and that's starting to change a little bit. In U.S. colleges, now it's always the men's basketball team and the women's basketball team. It's not the basketball team and the women's basketball team. But, you know, there's still the Lady Tigers or the Lady Bulldogs or, you know, the Lady Colorado State University, Lady Rams. Well, you know, that makes no sense. A ram is a male animal, and you can't be a lady male. But they call themselves Lady Rays. So, you know, so there's all sorts of problems here as women become involved, the challenges is when we become involved in sports and push the boundaries. So, so we can talk a little bit more about that next time, but more, we're falling way behind, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about gender and race and ethnicity in Brazil. So if any of you have some comments to make about that to help me out next time, feel free. We will try to move ahead and talk a little bit about social class and disability. I know ability and different types of abilities. So, and I know some of you are very interested in that. And Paralympics is an emerging phenomenon. And I think it's important for us to understand a little bit how Paralympics fits into the world of people with disabilities and so-called empire of the normal, which we all think we're a part of. And so we'll talk about those issues because this is one of the changes that we really need to focus on. But it's going to be 2 generations before we make really significant progress in getting people with disabilities involved in sport. And this is tougher than gender in many ways. So thanks for listening again. And we'll see you on Wednesday. And we'll talk after Wednesday. The people who are interested in disability issues, we're going to try to have a lunch together. And we'll talk about disability issues in ways that we didn't have a chance to talk about in class. And again, there's 100 slides. But this is on in the Dropbox, so take a look at it if you want, and we'll see you on Wednesday.